As of this morning, March the 16th, 2026, the President of the United States has personally contacted 7 allied nations asking them to deploy warships to the Strait of Hormuz. Every single one said no publicly and on the record. Trump posted on Truth Social, calling on China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and others to send their navies. When that got no response, he told the Financial Times that a refusal would be, in his words, very bad for the future of NATO. When that got no response, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, went on television and used words that changes the framing. He said, "The United States welcomes, encourages, and even demands allied participation. That is not the language of a partner requesting help. That is the language of a government that has run out of options." Then, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters, "These nations should contribute because they are," and this is her exact phrasing, "benefiting greatly from the United States military taking out the threat of Iran." Translation, "We started this war alone. We need you to treat it as a shared victory, and we need you to send your ships into the firing line to prove it." Not one country said yes. And it did not stop at the 7 he asked. Germany, Greece, Italy, and Spain all went on record refusing without even being named. We need to talk about why every single ally is rejecting Trump's call for help, what that tells us about where this conflict is heading, and how Iran is using control of the Strait to pull Trump's allies away from the U.S. and closer to Iran. Quickly before we continue, I want to thank you all for tuning in. Please make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you can stay updated. Here's what we know. The United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer held a press conference this morning and said, "We will not be drawn into the wider war." He added, "This was never envisioned to be a NATO mission." Trump's reaction to Starr was personal. He mocked the prime minister for telling him he needed to consult his team before making a decision. Trump said, this is a direct quote, "You do not need to meet with your team. You are the prime minister." That is a sitting American president publicly ridiculing the leader of America's closest ally for following basic democratic process, Germany. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius gave a 7-word response that carries more weight than any policy paper. "This is not our war. We have not started it." Foreign Minister Johann Watul said Berlin expects Washington and Tel Aviv to inform us, to include us, and to tell us when their goals are achieved. That is not the language of an ally hedging. That is the language of a government demanding to be treated as something other than a cleanup crew. France hedged but functionally refused. President Macron referenced a possible future mission when circumstances permit. The circumstance he is waiting for is the end of hostilities, which means he has agreed to nothing during the only window that matters. Canada declined. Australia's Transport Minister Catherine King said the United States has not formally asked for support, and CRA is not prepared to offer it. Japan said it is reviewing its options within the scope of Japanese law, but has no plans to send ships. Greece said no. Italy's foreign minister said diplomacy must prevail. Spain's defense minister Margarita Robles delivered what might be the sharpest rejection of all. She said, "Spain will never accept any stopgap measures because the objective must be for the war to end, and for it to end now." Then the European Union weighed in collectively. Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas gathered EU foreign ministers in Brussels to discuss Europe's response to the Iran war and the pressure from Washington to help secure the strait. Afterward, she said there was no appetite to extend the EU's ask by its naval mission into Hormuz, adding nobody wants to go actively in this war. 0 countries have committed forces. That is the situation as of this afternoon. Stay with me because the rejection itself is only half the picture. We need to talk about why every single one of these nations calculated that refusing the United States was the safer bet. And towards the end, I'm going to walk you through the one Iranian strategy that's quietly pulling American allies away from Washington faster than any threat ever could. Most people think this rejection is about political disagreement. They see it as European leaders grandstanding, playing to domestic audiences, avoiding risk. In reality, the refusal is structural. It follows a logic so consistent across a dozen capitals that it reveals something broken at the foundation of the entire alliance system. Every nation that said no arrived at that answer through a different internal debate, but they all landed on the same conclusion. And the reasons converge into a pattern that the White House either does not see or cannot afford to acknowledge. The first and deepest reason is consultations, or rather, the total absence of them. In the days before February 28th, Trump reportedly told Gulf Arab allies the entire operation would be finished in 4 days, total capitulation. Kevin Hassett, his chief economic advisor, repeated a 4 to 6 week timeline on the Sunday shows this past weekend and insisted the administration was ahead of schedule. That timeline has already been contradicted by Israel's own military, which announced this week that the war will last at least 3 more weeks with thousands of targets remaining. Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th. What is clearly visible now is that key allies felt they had not been given enough clarity about U.S. war aims, timelines, or the conditions for ending the conflict. That frustration came through publicly in Europe, where officials repeatedly asked Washington to explain its strategic goals and exit plan. As Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna put it, what will be the plan? The Wall Street Journal reported this week that the administration planned to announce a convoy coalition as early as today, but buried in that same reporting was a detail that undoes the entire announcement. The nations involved are still debating whether operations would begin before or after a ceasefire. If the coalition only activates after the fighting stops, it is not a wartime alliance. It is a cleanup agreement disguised as a show of force. The second reason is the relationship itself. For years, Trump targeted these same allies with tariffs, withdrawal threats, public insults, and NATO funding ultimatums. He pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. He called the alliance obsolete. He imposed trade penalties on European steel and aluminum. He ridiculed Macron, Merkel, and Trudeau on the global stage. And now, the first time he genuinely needs their military cooperation, he is not asking. He is threatening. He told the Financial Times that NATO faces a very bad future if countries do not comply. He told reporters, "We will remember that is not coalition building. That is coercion from a position of weakness, and every government on that call list recognizes it. The third reason is domestic. European voters are overwhelmingly hostile to this conflict. Energy prices on the continent were already painful from the post-Ukraine era. Brent crude has now surged past $100 a barrel. Petrol prices are climbing across every EU member state. Natural gas is spiking because Qatar's liquefied natural gas, which European nations have relied on heavily since cutting ties with Russian supply transits, the very strait that is now effectively sealed. Any European leader who sends warships into the Persian Gulf alongside the American Navy is ending their own political career. Robles in Madrid understood that. Torius in Berlin understood that. Starmer in London understood that. The fourth reason runs even deeper. The war is directly enriching Russia. Kajakali said it publicly. The Strait of Hormuz closure is funneling revenue into Moscow's war machine because every dollar oil climbs above 70 is another dollar funding Russia's campaign in Ukraine. And here's the part that infuriates Brussels more than anything. The United States is simultaneously granting sanctions waivers allowing India and other nations to purchase Russian crude already at sea. NATO's primary strategic concern is Russia. The war Trump is waging against Iran is financing the adversary that NATO actually exists to confront. He is asking European capitals to send destroyers to the Gulf while his own Treasury Department greenlights Russian oil sales. The contradiction is not subtle. It is policy. Now, we need to talk about the geography because even if the political will existed, the military problem is severe. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, and Iran controls the mountainous northern shoreline. Tehran has spent decades preparing to threaten shipping there with mines, missiles, drones, fast attack craft, and other asymmetric tactics. The U.S. military has already said it destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels near the strait, which shows how quickly any escort mission could turn into a direct shooting war. Naval experts have warned that reopening Hormuz safely while active hostilities continue would be extremely difficult even for major Western navies. There's also a recent precedent that no defense ministry has forgotten: the Red Sea. The Houthi disruption was a smaller-scale preview of exactly this scenario. A non-state militia with a fraction of Iran's capabilities shut down one of the busiest shipping corridors on Earth. Two administrations launched strikes. Biden admitted the strikes were not working and continued them anyway. Trump did the same and eventually walked away. The Red Sea was never fully secured. Every allied military strategist drew one conclusion from that episode. If the full power of the American Navy could not reopen the Red Sea against the Houthis, no patchwork coalition is going to hold the Strait of Hormuz against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which fields anti-A-ship ballistic missiles, fast attack craft, submarines, and a coastal missile network hardened over 4 decades of preparation for exactly this confrontation. And now the part that matters most, the part most coverage has missed entirely. Iran is not just blocking the strait. Iran is using the strait as a sorting mechanism. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi went on CBS and stated it plainly. The Strait of Hormuz is open. It is only closed to American, Israeli, and allied vessels. Others are free to pass. Then Tehran proved it. A Pakistani-flagged Aframax tanker called the Karachi transited the strait on March 16th, carrying Abu Dhabi crude. 2 Indian LPG carriers passed through safely. A Turkish vessel received clearance from Tehran. China is in direct negotiations with Iran for guaranteed passage of its crude and Qatari LNG shipments. France and the United Kingdom have reportedly opened back-channel talks with Tehran about securing their own vessels. Follow that logic to its conclusion. Every allied capital now faces a choice. Join an American convoy mission. Guarantee that Iran classifies your ships as hostile targets. Or negotiate directly with Tehran. Stay out of the war and keep your oil flowing. Washington is offering its partners the privilege of becoming combatants. Tehran is offering them the privilege of becoming customers. For any government making that calculation, the answer is obvious. This is the strategic maneuver that no one in the administration appears to have anticipated. Iran has converted the strait from a military choke point into a diplomatic lever that is actively peeling allies away from American leadership. Every nation that negotiates with Tehran for safe passage is implicitly recognizing Iranian authority over the waterway, whom every successful transit arranged through Iranian channels is a quiet rejection of American power. The alliance is not just failing to assemble, it is being disassembled from the outside by the very adversary the war was supposed to eliminate. And the economic architecture underneath all of this is collapsing in parallel. Before the war, 138 ships transited the strait daily. As of this week, UK Maritime Trade Operations reports no more than 5. Oil exports through the waterway have dropped below 10% of pre-conflict levels, according to the IEA. Brent crude is trading between $102 and $16 a barrel. It touched $120 last week. The IEA announced on March 11th the largest emergency reserve release in its 52-year history, 400 million barrels across 32 nations. The United States alone is contributing 172 million barrels from a strategic petroleum reserve that only contains 415 million. That is 41% of America's entire emergency stockpile, and the release has not stabilized prices. Crude climbed 17% in the days following the announcement. Iraq's southern oilfield production has collapsed 70%, falling from 4.3 million barrels a day to 1.3 million. Kuwait has announced precautionary output cuts. Saudi Arabia is rerouting what it can through its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yamu, but that pipeline was never built to replace the strait. The deficit stands at roughly 12 million barrels per day and no combination of reserves. Pipelines and alternate routes can close it, and it is not only oil. Global liquefied natural gas supply has been cut by 20% because Qatar, a major LNG exporter, ships through the same choke point. That directly undermines Europe's effort to replace Russian gas since 2022. Fertilizer, helium, and uranium shipments are also stalled. China has already tapped its strategic fertilizer reserve. The United States does not have one. Meanwhile, the broader global picture continues to fracture. North Korea fired multiple ballistic missiles into the sea 2 days ago during U.S.-South Korea military drills, adding to the sense of regional instability in East Asia. China has increased military activity around Taiwan. The PLA headquarters is reportedly monitoring this conflict on live screens, tracking missile trajectories and strike patterns in real time. They're not intervening, they're studying. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest aviation hubs on the planet, was struck by a drone today that hit a fuel depot and forced a temporary suspension of operations. Commercial flights bound for Dubai turned around mid-route. Qatar intercepted a second wave of Iranian missiles this morning. Kuwait's airport remains shuttered. Abu Dhabi is running at limited capacity, and David Sachs, a Trump administration advisor, publicly warned about the risk of nuclear escalation. That remark stood out because it brought a taboo scenario into open discussion, even if officials remain careful about how they speak publicly about Israel's capabilities. So, put the full picture together. The assumption before February 28th, 4 days, total Iranian capitulation. The Strait stays open. Allies fall in line. The reality, week 3, the Strait is under Iranian control. Oil above $100, the largest reserve release in history failing to hold prices, and a unanimous public on the record rejection from every allied capital Washington contacted. The assumption regime collapse. The reality, the son of the killed supreme leader assumed power within 72 hours and declared the Strait will remain sealed as leverage. The assumption, the coalition forms quickly. Escorts begin. Global trade resumes. The reality, not one nation has committed a single warship, and several are now negotiating directly with Tehran for the access Washington promised its coalition would provide. The assumption on Iran's side also deserves scrutiny. Tehran framed its closure as total. The reality is selective, with passage granted to nations willing to deal bilaterally. That is not a blockade born of strength. It is a calculated gamble that depends on the war not escalating to the point where Iran's own coastline becomes the front line. If the administration moves toward a ground seizure of Kar Island, which handles 90% of Iran's crude exports, Tehran's leverage evaporates. Iran's gamble requires that escalation does not reach that threshold. Whether that bet holds is the question neither side can answer tonight. And the only question left is whether the next phase of this conflict is decided by Washington, by Tehran, by the dozen allied governments that have just told the most powerful military on earth that it is on its own. Thanks a lot for watching. I really appreciate your support. Join the discussion in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts. Who do you think is winning the war? What do you think will happen next? Do you think any other nation will join in? Let me know. And please subscribe and like the video if you want to stay updated. And click the video on the screen to see another.